Underwater caves are beautiful and very mysterious and deadly, beckoning to those who are free-spirited and adventurous at heart. And unfortunately for one young man, it would be the last time he would ever get to see them. Join me, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Den. In 2010, Ben McDaniel of Colliver, Tennessee, had been going through what his family would say a rough patch in his life. His marriage had ended in a divorce, and the construction company that he had owned and built from the ground up had gone bankrupt, leaving him with approximately $50,000 in debt. And to add to all of this, he was diagnosed with severe depression following the death of his younger brother, Paul, who in 2008 had died of a stroke at the age of 22. Seeking to get a fresh start to try to leave his worries behind, Ben decided to move away to Florida to live at his parents' beach home at Santa Rosa Beach on the Emerald Coast. Ben was able to relax in his new environment, and his parents and girlfriend reported that he had been making great improvements in his outlook on life, and he seemed to be the most optimistic and happiest he had been in a very long time. The move also allowed him to engage in taking up an old hobby of his, which was scuba diving. Ben got some gear and began to become a regular diver at the freshwater spring and cavern system called the Vortex Springs. Although a very popular diving spot, Vortex Springs is not for the inexperienced or faint of heart, featuring an expansive cavern that begins at 58 feet below the surface, which leads on to a deep and narrow cave that starts at around 115 feet and goes on for an additional 300 feet until it ends at a locked gate, preventing further access into the cave system to all but the most qualified and experienced of divers who are given permission to enter. Diving in the cave is a dangerous venture, a fact which is driven home by the sign at its entrance carrying a warning. Beyond the gate, the cave system continues into a network of tunnels and caverns that has been mapped so far to over 1,600 feet, with much of the cave system still unexplored. Considering the darkness and the disorientating twisting tunnels that sometimes become too narrow that even experienced divers who are allowed to progress past the gate must at times take off their tanks in order to squeeze through, it is no wonder that well over a dozen divers have lost their lives here. Perilous, dangerous, and harrowing. These are words which would be no stranger to the Vortex Springs. Despite the inherent fatal dangers of this site, Vortex Springs is nevertheless one of the most popular premier diving spots in the state, and divers flock here to see the natural underwater beauty and due to the challenge level involved. Ben was overjoyed by the site. He was hooked, and he had been researching cave diving, going on to become a regular diver there, and that he was well known by the dive shop staff and other regulars at Vortex Springs. He was known for secretly exploring the cave up to the gate, even though he did not possess the required certification for this. And on the day of August 18th, 2010, Ben went to Vortex Springs as usual and took a midday dive, where he was witnessed by other divers to be intently examining the entrance of the cave, after which he resurfaced. He then spent the rest of the day making notes in his dive log and testing his equipment before heading out for another dive in the evening. He then made a final call to his family and began another dive at 7:30 p.m., just as the sun was sinking below the horizon and nightfall was approaching. Ben was seen by two other divers and employees at the dive shop. The employees were Chuck Cronin and Ed Tarrin. As he descended, they reported that he had been wearing a helmet and lights, since it seemed by his gear that he was intending to go cave diving, as well as the fact that he was considered to be a fairly experienced regular diver at the site, and on top of the fact that he had been suspected of trying to force the gate open in the past, Ed Taryn went and unlocked the gate for him, even though it was against the policy to do so, and he did not have the proper qualifications for it. It would be the last time anyone would ever see Ben McDaniels. The next morning, Ben's truck was still parked in the dive shop. It was not until the next day that dive shop employees realized something was wrong and notified authorities, and an inspection of the area turned up with no signs of Ben or his equipment. And in his truck were found his wallet with $700 in cash, a cell phone, and a dive log, as well as a cave map that he wrote, showing no signs of any struggle or anything out of the ordinary. When the beach house where Ben was living at was checked, they found nothing, except his dog unfed and the place completely undisturbed. Authorities quickly came to the conclusion that Ben had gotten stuck down in the cave system and drowned. In the wake of Ben's disappearance, many experienced divers gathered on the site to aid in recovery operations to try and find his body. Over the next few days, these divers would extensively go through the cave system, meticulously checking every tunnel, every passageway, and every crevice where Ben could have possibly been, but no trace of him was found. Professional cave diver and recovery specialist Ed Sorensen flew in and risked his life making 3 separate dives, penetrating far beyond what Ben had mapped out, searching every available section. During these perilous dives, Sorensen used smaller tanks to allow him to squeeze into more inaccessible areas, yet still he found nothing. There was no sign of the body, and even no evidence of sand or mud being disturbed, as well as no trace of any increased marine life activity that might signify a corpse. Throughout the exhaustive search, the only sign of Ben was 2 discarded spare oxygen tanks left right at the entrance of the cave, which would start the trail of bizarre details in the case that would serve to deepen the mystery. The location of the tanks was strange, considering cave divers do not typically leave their extra tanks at the entrance of a cave, but rather at various points along their route in order to aid them in their exit or if there is an emergency. When the tanks were analyzed later, they would prove to contain just pure oxygen, and not the oxygen gas mix that would typically be in such tanks. Considering that Ben McDaniel was a fairly experienced diver, he would have known better, and done his research beforehand. These details seem strange and out of place. Another curious detail is that Ben was a rather large man, standing at 6'1" and weighing about 210 pounds. Considering this and the added bulk of his regular-sized tanks, it seems impossible that he could have managed to shove himself into certain areas that could not even be reached by divers much smaller than he was, especially without specialized training. Sorensen would later comment saying this, "I know what I'm doing, and I barely made it through. The last place I searched was pristine, without a mark that a diver had been there. It would be impossible to go through that restriction without making a mark on the floor or ceiling. I'm telling you, he's not in there." Considering that the expansive, intensive search of the cave by numerous experienced divers covered a total of 36 days, there was the increasingly prevalent idea that he was simply not there, and had at some point exited the water, and some even say, if he had even ever been there at all. What happened then was up for intense debate, with one idea was that Ben had been the victim of foul play, and that he had been intentionally drowned only for the murderer to remove the body and dispose of it on land. Yet extensive use of cadaver dogs in the vicinity had turned up, with no sign of him either. Another idea was that the body had somehow drifted out and floated down Vortex Springs outflow into Blue Creek and Sandy Creek, which is connected to the Chattahoochee River. But a massive search along this area also found no sign of Ben, and comprehensive water tests along these waterways for increased bacterial activity that might have indicated a rotting corpse came out negative. Yet another idea was that Ben had faked his own death and intentionally vanished in order to escape his debts, but there was no real evidence to back this claim up. It would later be shown that he had already paid off his debts at the time of his vanishing. His family has also remained adamant that he would have never left behind his beloved dog or subject his family and girlfriend to this. In the years since his mysterious vanishing, Ben's family have become increasingly convinced that he was a victim of foul play, and have even hired a private investigator who thinks that his body was removed from the water before authorities were notified, or that he was killed on land and his body was disposed of, with the whole diving accident merely a cover story. Another possibility is that the dive shop employees had found Ben's body after he drowned and removed it in order to avoid prosecution. The family have also claimed that there is something odd about the fact that Ed Taryn, the last person to have seen Ben alive, was released as a person of interest, and that the family also believes that there are dark implications to the death of the owner of Vortex Springs. Ben's family believes that the death was not accidental and is somehow related to his disappearance. Adding to these suspicious details, it also seems odd that no one at the dive shop noticed that Ben's truck was sitting untouched until 2 days later. They firmly believe that both Taryn and Cronin, who were the last to see Ben, that they know more about what happened than they are letting on, although just what that might be remains unclear. The mysterious disappearance of Ben McDaniels remains unsolved to this day. Thanks for watching. Till next time.